Welcome, everybody. There we go. I'm a little more in frame there. My name is David MacDonald, and I am the chaplain at Ohio Northern University, and I'll be one of your co-presenters this evening. And so just a little bit about myself. I've been at Ohio Northern for 8 years now as the university chaplain. I've been on UMCMA's COCOM for a few years now. I don't know exactly how many, but it's been a wonderful journey. So it seems like it's been longer than I'm sure it has been, but it's been great. And I am going to be talking tonight primarily about the spiritual practices side of things. My area of study is Benedictine spirituality and monastic spirituality in general. So I'll be talking a little bit about that. And I'll turn over to Sarah to introduce herself.
Thanks. Hey, everybody. It's good to see your faces, your pixelated faces. I'm Sarah. I know some of you here, not all of you. I am a psychotherapist in private practice. My background in education is in clinical social work. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and my master's and PhD are both in clinical social work. So I, see clients on a range of mental health issues, depression, anxiety, relationship issues, et cetera. A number of the clients on my caseload are students. And I also, I used to have a full-time position with GBHEM. Now I kind of transitioned into a consulting role. But I work with the Office of Collegiate Ministries around issues of student well-being, kind of supporting and resourcing campus ministers and chaplains around those issues of mental health. And as many of you know, one of my big projects that I worked on while I was there full-time was creating a curriculum that sort of helped to equip campus ministers and chaplains to, kind of help students build psychosocial skills, help them to work through some of these issues so that, not so that y'all would become clinicians yourselves, but just to give you some sort of boots on the ground tools to use with students to help improve their well-being. So that's just a little bit about me. Yeah.
Thanks, Sarah. So we're gonna have a pretty simple structure this evening. We're gonna start off with Sarah's gonna go a little more in depth into issues surrounding mental health and young adults, and then we're gonna have a little bit of a conversation together about the relationship between spiritual practices and mental health. And then I'm going to talk about some suggested spiritual practice for campus ministry, some things that I've come across. And then we'll leave some time at the end for questions and answers. So if you have any of those, you can feel free to put them in the Zoom chat at any point, and we'll get to those at the end. Or if it fits in, we'll fit them in as we're talking as well. But if you're not familiar with it, if you go to the bottom of your screen, sort of hover over the bottom of the screen, there's a thing there that has a chat. Click on that and it'll take you to where you can put a chat for the whole group or anybody in the group. So Sarah, why don't you get us started and tell us a little bit about sort of what the lay of the land when it comes to mental health and young adults.
Yeah, absolutely. So pre-coronavirus, a lot has changed in the last handful of months, as you all know, but pre-coronavirus, I think it was maybe 2017, a few years ago, GBHEM had surveyed campus ministers and chaplains, collegiate ministry personnel, and had just asked you all, what is the biggest concern around your students? What do you need resourcing in? And overwhelmingly, you all came back and said mental health issues. That is one of the biggest concerns across the board. And so when I came on staff at GBHEM in 2018, I started researching this. Like, is this need or this expressed concern by our constituency reflective of what's actually happening on the larger scale? And what I found was, yes, indeed, students overwhelmingly are experiencing increased depression, increased anxiety, increased DSM-5 diagnosable mental illnesses compared to earlier cohorts. There are a lot of reasons around that. One of the main reasons around that was kind of this fundamental shift that was happening in our culture around technology, the use of technology, how that impacted relationships. And basically what I was finding in the research is this trend upwards in diagnosable mental illnesses pretty much directly corresponded with the invention of the smartphone, right? So as we saw screens enter our lives in a way where we were daily dependent upon them, scrolling on them, and social media and all of that stuff really came to the forefront, we saw a decline in mental health. This is especially true among young adults. And so we were like, what is going on here? What is happening? And we learned a number of things. I mean, being on screens as we are now, sort of almost trained to do, means we have shorter attention spans, means we have fewer, interpersonal skills in real time, means that we have fewer sort of like self-regulating skills, right? When I get anxious, rather than going outside and taking a deep breath, I just scroll through social media, which makes me then more anxious, right? And students don't have that innate ability, and they're not learning those practices that help them to self-regulate. So there's all kinds of reasons why, but those are just a few. So that's pre-coronavirus. And then a worldwide pandemic hit, right? And what we already knew was an epidemic of mental health issues has skyrocketed even more. So we're seeing that about 85% of students are feeling increased stress, increased anxiety around COVID. 20% of college students say their mental health has significantly worsened under coronavirus. And it's for all of the reasons that I'm sure you are personally probably experiencing in your own lives, right? Social isolation, disconnection from peers, fears about what's going to happen. And perhaps maybe most relevant to this conversation is this sort of existential question of like, how do I make meaning of this, right? Like, what do I do with like the entire world around me getting sick and actually dying? So mental health is like even more important right now than maybe it ever was, and that's saying a lot considering where we were, just at the beginning of this year. So maybe David, I'll turn it over to you. I mean, that's just kind of like the basic lay of the land as I see it in terms of what we're facing, what our students are facing on campus.
Yeah, I would say that as a chaplain, I certainly see a lot of that with my students, and especially so since we've been in the middle of this pandemic. When I talk to our students on campus, and quite often I'm asked to come in and talk to classes about spiritual practices and those kind of things, and especially we have a large emphasis on sort of medical professions at our university. And so when I talk with our medical professions students, I often talk about the the effects of meditation on blood pressure, heart rate, the general physical things that one can get benefits from for in practicing spiritual practices. But I know that the work that you've done with the Awakened Life delves into the relationship between the spiritual practices and well-being in general, but specifically mental health well-being. So is there anything in particular that stands out to you in that work that you've done that sort of points in the direction of, something we could say, here's the effects that it has on your mental health when you participate in spiritual practices?
Yeah, absolutely. So, so like you were saying, meditation, mindfulness, what we might call in the Christian circles, like contemplative practices, we know those are effective in treating mental illness. There is a wide swath of research that shows that. So, and there are a number of clinical interventions out there in the world, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, mindfulness-based stress reduction, that actually teach these sort of meditation and mindfulness skills, and they are effective in reducing anxiety and stress and depression. And I mean, as I see that, it's a direct response to this sort of crisis of attention that we have in our culture, right? We aren't able to attend even to one another, much less what's happening in ourselves. And so, it makes sense that we would be anxious. It makes sense that we would feel disconnected and depressed, when I can't sit for 5 minutes with my friend and actually have a conversation before scrolling and trying to find the next thing. It makes sense that then, that would result in mental health issues. And so all that to say, the Awakened Life, this curriculum that we designed, draws on some of these clinical interventions that we know work, mindfulness-based clinical interventions. And what it tries to do is to take that science or those, those sort of interventions that we know and infuse our history, our, sort of, as United Methodists and Christians at large, sort of our contemplative practices into this format. And it's an 8-week guide that delves into these spiritual practices as a way to address anxiety and stress and depression, as a way to help center students and teach them those skills that they maybe have never had a chance to teach, right? It teaches students how to pay attention to themselves, to one another. And let's be honest, folks, like, I need this too, right? I mean, like, I feel like it's not just students, but like all of us are kind of in this same boat. And it's interesting because we've been running, a number of trainings with some of the leaders on campus who are going to be teaching this, and I struggle. I struggle. So yeah, but that's a little bit about how we see spiritual practices and mental health kind of dovetailing. So I don't know if you want to speak to that, David, about what you found in your work and in what you're reading about, especially like the Benedictine practices and stuff. But.
Yeah. I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but I think monastics are some of the most well-balanced, well-adjusted people I've ever met. They tend to be fairly unflappable about a lot of things, and they tend to take the long view as well. I think about history, about their own personal, growth, and I've had for the last several years now, my spiritual director is not a Benedict, but a Franciscan sister, and she tends to have a very sort of holistic approach to spiritual direction, in which she does emphasize things like mind, body, spirit connections, and how each of those has an impact on the others. And I think that's unique, not just to monasticism, but I think it's unique to people who have that sort of mindful approach to life. I think one of my jobs on campus as a chaplain is to work with people of lots of different faiths. And I see this in people who are deeply embedded in faiths of all sorts. I happen to believe that Christianity is the one that works for me, and that I think is the true, practice. But I see this same sense of balance. And, St. Benedict talks a lot about balance. His rule is is basically set up to help the monks to balance what he called ora et labora, prayer and work, or prayer and life, might be another way to put it. And it's really not just about balance, but it's also about prioritizing, because in order to have that balance, you have to know what's most important for you. And I really think that's where one of the places where this makes a connection is that it helps students to begin to prioritize, how do I spend my time? What do I do with the space that I'm given in this world? How am I gonna inhabit that space in a way that does no harm? As Methodists, we start with that, but then maybe even does some good in the world. And so, yeah, I think that there is a deep connection between these spiritual practices and what I would call, or what I am calling right now, sort of the spirituality of the ordinary. I've got a spiritual directee that I've been working with recently he's tried every practice imaginable. I like just a laundry list, every book that you can go through, Foster, any of the classics in spiritual disciplines. He's gone through them and practiced all these things. And finally we were sitting talking a couple weeks ago, and he said, I'm beginning to think that maybe going for a walk with my dog might be a spiritual discipline. And I said, oh yeah, I wonder what it might be like if you were to see other things that you do in your everyday life as a spiritual discipline. And a couple of years ago, I worked with my students on the practice of the presence of God by Brother Lawrence. And one of the things that I think they found from that is that it's often those ordinary tasks, the washing of the dishes, the sweeping of the floor, the tidying of a space, that can become not just a distraction from all of the other things, screens and those kind of things, but can actually become a meditative, contemplative kind of practice. And so what I try to do is to encourage my students to think about, what are the things that you do on a regular basis, and what if that was to be your rule of life? Like, you don't have to go off and be a monk or a nun. You could actually have a rule of life just doing what you're doing right now. Yeah, so I think that there's a deep connection there between those two things. Sarah, when you are working with your clients, especially younger people, are there certain traditions or practices that you think they sort of naturally gravitate towards, or are there things that you sort of gently guide them towards? What seems to work with the young people you work with?
Yeah, that's a good question. I personally, in my own life, for me, I meditate using Vipassana style meditation, which is a Buddhist style of meditation. And so when I'm working with my clients, that's kind of the practice that's most familiar to me, and most overlaps the most with some of these other clinical interventions that I mentioned, MBCT, MBSR. And so I will teach people how to do that. And basically what that is, I mean, it's not super fancy. You probably all have done it. It's, first connecting to the body, or connecting to the breath and connecting to the body, centering in our physical space. And then paying attention to emotions that come up, paying attention to thoughts, and noticing them as something that are real, that happen in our head, but aren't necessarily always true, right? We can have a thought and not always identify with it, not claim that it is us. Does that make sense? So it helps people to kind of pull back from that thought storm that we get lost in. Mm-hmm. So that's the tradition that I tend to use. But I mean, I really resonate with what you're saying, David. I mean, that's just because me, that's, you know, that was just sort of my personal preference and what I resonate with, how I connect to God. But yeah, like, you know, Thich Nhat Hanh talks about walking meditation, practice of the presence of God. In the Awakened Life, we use all kinds of different things. The Ignatian method of prayer, we talk about, just a number of things. We give some guided meditations. And so really, it's not necessarily about like this one prescribed thing that works, right? But it's helping people to stop long enough to be curious about what might work for them, you know, some things, to invite them into that space. And the emphasis is on practice, because right off the bat, what you will hear from students, I 100% guarantee it, is, oh, I'm not good at this. You know, or this is hard, my thoughts are like, you know, distracting me. I'm not good at, I have ADD, right? Yes. Right. We all are not good at it. Right? We all have attention issues, especially now more than ever. Like, you're not born good at this. That's not the point. The idea, the whole sort of meaning behind this is that you are invited to practice something. You are invited to do something different. You don't sit down at a piano and start playing Bach, right? You practice, you learn, and you tap in, and you get frustrated, and you come back. And that's what this is about. Most people who are struggling with a mental illness are like, fix me now, you know, what do you got? Because that's what our culture has provided for us, right? We are a click, purchase now, consumerist, you know, quick, easy answer. And the reality is that, you know, the problems that are affiliated with our mental illness or our struggles to be whole took years and years and years and years to put into place, right? And it's not something that can be undone overnight. It takes years and years to actually sort of establish some healthy practices to reconnect to ourselves. Now, if somebody is in an acute suicidal situation, that's different, right? There are things that you can do in the immediate, you know, here and now to de-escalate and you know, have sort of a critical intervention like that. But in terms of long-term wholeness and well-being, it's an intentional practice, day after day after day. So
yeah, I often emphasize with directees that they're called practices and disciplines for a reason. You know, you have to practice it, and it does take discipline, and it's not something that you're going to get right away and be this superstar, you know, spiritual person, if that's even a goal that any of us could attain. But I want to go back just a few minutes ago when you talked about, you know, the thoughts and emotions that are in our heads and how we often don't connect to those. We've been rewatching the Harry Potter movies, and in the last one, when Harry's in the sort of in-between place that looks like King's Cross Station, it's not death, but it's also not life. He says to Dumbledore, is this real, or is it all in my head? And then Dumbledore says, of course it's in your head, but that doesn't make it any less real. You know, and I think that's true too. I think sometimes our thoughts, our emotions, even the spiritual struggles that we go through, the questions and doubts that we have with our faith, those can manifest themselves physically, emotionally, you know, in a lot of different ways, relationally, you know, with other people. The other thing I think is interesting that you talk about, you begin with your practice, your own practice. And I think that's something I would want to emphasize to all of us, is that, you know, the saying one of my students often says to me is, you can't pour from an empty cup. And all of us who are campus ministers, I think, have to be practicing as well. So I always say, every pastor needs a pastor, every spiritual director needs a spiritual director, every therapist needs a therapist. And
amen.
And I think we talked about this when you and I first met to talk about this workshop. You know, there's like this ongoing never-ending circle of therapists and spiritual directors that just kind of offer spiritual direction to each other and therapy. But it is true. I think we need to practice these things as well. So, yeah. So for me, and I think this is a practice that might be mentioned in Awakened Life, but I know it's mentioned in my work, which is Lectio Divina,
Yes.
which is a a text base, and as Christians we obviously our primary text is Scripture, but I've utilized Lectio not just with Scripture but with lots of different kinds of written works. This may trigger some people, but one of my favorite poets is Mary Oliver, who talk about the spirituality of the ordinary. Um, Mary Oliver was an atheist, but she had a very deep spirituality, and she notices these details in her poems, things like the way a grasshopper moves its mandibles. She writes about moving it sideways instead of up and down, and you know, working with that poem with students has opened up avenues for discussion and in depth that might not have existed before if we were just doing a typical kind of Bible study, or something like that. And then to then take it from there to saying, okay, now let's look at this psalm and see the detail that is within that as well. I think it's a way to kind of help students to make that transition from, oh, I'm not, like you said, I'm not good at this, to, oh, this is actually something I can relate to. Like, I cannot tell you the number of people that I've done Lexio with poetry, and they go into it saying, oh my gosh, I hate poetry because I can never understand it. And then by the time we're done, they're like, wow, I've got this totally new understanding of this, and it doesn't have to be the same as yours, and wow, imagine that. So.
Yeah, and I mean that's kind of the whole idea of this, like the idea of like the awakened life.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like we walk through our lives sleep, in a dream. All of this beauty and nature and people, and sort of the simple act of paying attention can wake us up to this whole new experience of life, and I love how you're describing that with like poetry, and how Mary Oliver talks about they move the grasshopper's legs move in a certain way, and I think about how robbed we are of understanding that, how we rob ourselves of seeing that when it's, pop-up ad after pop-up ad, and that's all we have,
Mm-hmm.
So there's this richness that comes with that attention, or that ability to wake up.
So we have our first question, and Tim asks, he says, in this time of work from home, I'm wondering about the relationship between the idea of integration of our secular and sacred space together, using the daily life to discover the sacred, and the idea of the need for boundaries between work and play when we stop work and not let it bleed into play. So how do we create boundaries within our life as campus ministers, as practitioners, so that it doesn't become sort of a never-ending cycle of I'm always on?
Yeah, man, that is a really interesting question. I've actually been sort of sitting with that myself, especially now, right? As like, that's my kitchen, and like I have the laundry, as and I'm also working, and and there is something to creating healthy rhythms where at the end of the day, it's 5 o'clock and I'm intentionally shutting my computer and turning off the light in my office space and like physically moving and getting up and changing, locations. There's something to be said about that. At the same time, I'm struck by, this idea that like, we can just compartmentalize our lives, right? Like now I have my work hat on and now I have my family hat on, and this has this coronavirus and being at home has emphasized even more how that idea of like work-life balance seems sort of,
Mm-hmm.
it just doesn't seem attainable in the same way. Sort of like a false, ideal.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been experimenting with just like inviting myself to like be present where I am when I'm working, work with my full attention. And that's my life, And when I'm cooking, cook with my full attention, when I'm eating with my husband, it's not like then life starts, right? It's like when I'm working, that's part of it, but I'm really doing it.
Mm-hmm.
When I'm eating, that's part of life as well. And I'm really doing it with all my heart, right? Like, so showing up for myself, whether it's work or play or whatever, I don't know if that makes sense, but.
Yeah, it does to me. I hope it I hope it does to others. But I was sort of fumbling here because I was reaching for my copy of the Rule of Saint Benedict, because he has a lot to talk. He has a lot to say here, because the monastery is a place where both the sacred and the secular come together. There is, one of my mentors explained this to me recently. He said, there's the chapel, the church where the monks have their daily round of prayers, but then there's also space for sleep and for eating and for receiving guests. And all of this is centered around a green space, the cloister, which is a reminder of the fact that God has created us as part of this vast universe to be present to all of those spaces that we create within that universe for doing the things that we do. And I think there's something to be said about having a sense of ritual. For me, it's important to say, as I've been working from home, to say, this is my space where I'm working, and I don't sit down at that space to do other things. And that I begin and end that time of working with some very simple rituals, like a reading of a psalm or a prayer or something like that, to kind of get me in that mindset. And then, as you say, being fully present in that moment, and in that work, so that when I go to the next thing, I can be fully present there. And I had a friend who in seminary who had originally been a doctor before going to seminary, and he said, in medical school, one of the things they taught them was about washing your hands. And we've done a lot of washing hands in the last several months as well. But, the washing of hands for a doctor is not just so that you don't carry, disease from one room to the next, but it can also be a time to kind of let whatever has happened in that session, whether it be a checkup or a surgery or whatever you've been doing with that patient, to let that wash down the drain. And then to move on to the next patient. And so there have been times, like if I've had a particularly difficult or intense situation with working with a student, or a spiritual direction session where there's been just a lot of stuff dumped onto me, I'll get up, go to the sink, wash my hands, and say, okay, that's been washed away now. I can let that go, and I'm not going to carry that with me into the next room that I go into. So I think it takes time. I think it takes some patience with yourself, and being being easy with yourself, to say, oh, darn it, I did it again. I brought the stuff from work into my living space, but tomorrow I can do it again. I can do better. And yeah, as Lauren says, washing your hands is a good way to remember your baptism as well. So,
Yeah, I love that.
yeah, good.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
Are there any other questions that anybody has, or anything that you'd like to lift up as part of our conversation here? You can also turn your microphone on and ask a question if you'd like. That's perfectly acceptable.
Well, I'm Ellen O'Shaughnessy up in the corner there.
Hi, Ellen.
Hi. I don't understand why I'm not coming through visually, but in the spirit of this wonderful contemplative life here that you're presenting through the Benedictines, I do share with the students the different traditions of contemplation. And one of the things that we take to the scriptures and to the Quran is that very contemplative attitude, David and Sarah, that you are sharing. And so I have them take a bite out of the word. For example, in Mark, they love that Jesus notices that somebody's pulling at his cloak. And as we meditate on that, in fact, we were in Washington, D.C. in our mission trip when this happened. It was a Methodist student who said, wow, I am going to start pulling at Jesus' cloak. I have a few things I have to say. And it was just so beautifully contemplative. I said, that's what that big word means. You take a bite out of the word. And right now, during this a very tough time, we are studying the Gospel of Luke. And we will text one another. We will talk on the phone. We will email one another about Luke. Now, I chose Luke with them because I said, tradition says we can't prove it, but that Luke is a physician speaking to us. And we need each other to heal each other and listen to the Jesus, the risen one among us right now. So I so appreciate your religious traditions that you brought, and you should hear the beauty of Fatimata speaking from the Quran. It's a I can tell you from your smiles, all your smiles, it's a built-in contemplative attitude that the Muslims have been born and raised with those 55 times a day, Moses says back to Muhammad, that's too many times, 5 times.
Well, yeah, and I think you make a good point there, Ellen, that this is something that needs to be done in the context of community. For me, that's what I have discovered in studying the monastics is that it's very difficult to do a spiritual practice consistently all on your own. Mm-hmm. And that's especially true in this time when we're all sort of separated and we're doing things like Zoom calls and those kinds of things. But it's still important to be a part of a community of practice of some sort. And even if that's just, I'll practice in my home, you practice in your home, and we get together and talk about it. Or we journal about it online or do a blog together or some kind of communal aspect to this, I think is so important because number one, it provides the accountability that so often we fall out of practices because we don't have someone who's counting on us to do them. And so it's easy to make excuses. And then number two, it offers the support so that when we're feeling like there's just nothing there today, somebody can be there to say, well, that's okay because there was something there for so-and-so in our group, or, and so let's talk about the collective experience there. And I appreciate also, Ellen, your conversation there about different faith traditions, because as a chaplain, one of the things that I have had the wonderful experience of being able to do is to work with people of different faiths. And I had a Muslim student come to me once looking for spiritual direction. And I said to him, just out of curiosity, why have you chosen me? And he said, well, if I was at home in Saudi Arabia, I would go see my imam. And you're the closest thing that I have to that here on campus. But to know that even though we had differences of religious tradition and even some differences of practice and those kinds of things, to know that there is still something deeper, some meaning that we can get from this. And I think that's another place, Sarah, where the connection is made with mental health, because mental health issues cross all barriers of socioeconomic, cultural, ethnic, um, uh, religious backgrounds, and so that's where the connection, I think, can be made, where for some people, the entry into mental health work is through their spiritual practices. For other people, the mental health work becomes the entry into spiritual practices. So, Mark says, I've been reading Richard Rohr's The Wisdom Pattern, which offers the idea of spiritual direction being more like a rhythm of order, disorder, and reorder. We are in a time of disorder, it seems, and thus I'd like to ponder what our work with ourselves and our students looks and feels like when we embrace the liminality of this disordered time, leading to a reordering that we cannot see or predict or guarantee. Well, I think probably in a lot of ways, disorder definitely is the spirit of this age, isn't it? I mean, pandemic, racial violence, or violence against people who are minoritized, police brutality, you name it. United Methodist Church, there's a lot of disorder going on. So Sarah, do you have any reflections in that vein about the idea of order, disorder, and reordering?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, part of some of these mindfulness practices that I use are really designed to, how do I say it, sort of like help us unhinge from the illusion that we are always in control, right? Our culture likes us to think that we get what we want when we want it, and we order our lives, and we like direct the ship, and that sells more things, right? When we feel as if we have that power. Of course, we know that we don't. We know that we're finite. We know that we really control very little, including our own mortality, right? And this period of time, right, the pandemic, I think has been, and actually, all of the stuff that's happening with, the protests and sort of our fight for racial justice right now, has kind of like reminded us, our culture at large, like, you can't control it, like there is disorder and chaos in the world, and that's the work, right? Like learning to sit with your own smallness and being okay with that, being okay with the fact that like you can't change it, you can't control it, you can't, so yeah, so part of like kind of the intervention around mental health stuff, as we talk about disorder, is just helping us to be with that, to be okay with that in some way, and to face our, our mortality, how finite we are. Mary Oliver has a line about that. It's like, oh gosh, something about, three things in the world. We're tasked with doing three things in the world. To love what is ours, to hold it with everything we have, and then when the time comes, to let it go, to let it go. And she ends with this like, how can we let it go? So, Mark, I think that maybe speaks to that like disorder piece, that it's a spiritual practice to be in disorder.
Yeah, and I think there's something in the way that we have structured our contemporary life, especially in this part of the world, that we shy away from mortality and liminality. The idea that sometimes we have to go away, and that our rites of passage are rightly so very celebratory, but we've sort of skipped the point of rites of passage when we forget about the liminal space that you have to go through before the celebration. And so for me, I think liminality is a metaphor for young adulthood, for emerging adulthood.
Yeah.
It is that space where you're not a child, but you don't feel fully an adult, and you're not completely established, and you don't
Mm.
feel like you have everything figured out, and yet you know more than you knew even just a few years ago. And so you're sort of always stuck. And I think that underlies the anxiety that a lot of young people have about so-called adulting, that making those steps towards becoming a fully functional adult, and sometimes we try to put that off as much as we can. Um, and I think it's because we haven't addressed what it means as a culture for us to be uncomfortable and liminal,
Yeah.
and sort of in that in-between uncertain space.
Yeah. And I mean, I think you're absolutely right. Like, it's only through that
Mm-hmm.
darkness and chaos and whatever that transformation happens, right? We know that. I mean, we know that in the resurrection story.
Mm-hmm.
It's only in that, like, death and loss that we actually find, hope and space and
Mm-hmm.
newness. So, the only thing that gives me hope about the state of the world right now is thinking, like, gosh, if we've reached this level of disorder and death and darkness and loss, like, surely that means that some great reorder is on the other end of this, right? That's sort of my one, like, hopeful go-to. So.
Yeah, one of the things I've been telling my students for the last several years, and especially students who are going into ministry, is I take hope in Phyllis Tickle's statement that she used to say, every 500 years or so, the church goes through a giant rummage sale. We give up the things that we no longer need and that no longer make sense or fit, and we take, that leaves space for us to grow and to take on new things. And I think that's where we are. I think that's where we are right now. I think you can, to me, almost on a cosmic level, you can feel it. That there is change happening, not just in our faith, but in, I think, a lot of faith communities, and not just in our culture, but in a lot of cultures. There is this rummage sale going on, and we're starting to reprioritize what is important. And for me, I think I'm hoping what will come out of the pandemic is that people will have a better understanding of what their priorities are, what is most important for them, and maybe what things are not needed anymore because either you couldn't get them during the pandemic or you realized you could do without them.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Or
I have one that's kind of floating out there. For
Yep.
those of you who know me, you know that outdoors is a central piece of my own spirituality and my personal practice in a number of ways. And as we kind of move into this, I'm trying to figure out how to foster that with my students in terms of individually and encouraging for those for whom that resonates, how to make that happen. I mean, we're already doing a weekly hiking group where we're getting out, but we can't do that now because we have to get in the same car to drive there.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not working. So trying to figure out how to foster some of that. And we're also kind of playing with some of the wilding church stuff that was brought up last year at this conference. That was really fruitful for me. And just trying to figure out what some of that means during this time and ways to nurture that. Wasn't sure if that resonates with others or if others have some resources that kind of really are.
I've been amazed, Rob, by the number of people who have started gardens during the pandemic. I am one of them. I haven't grown vegetables for more than 15 years probably, and yet I'm growing about 4 or 5 different varieties of vegetables right now. For me, it's not just been about like trying to stock up or about trying to survive. It has been a real grounding experience for me. And I think, just the act of caring for something outside of yourself, something that needs you for food or water or whatever, I think can really be, it can be helpful in helping people to understand that we're part of something bigger. It's not just me and what my needs are, but I actually have this thing that's gonna, perish if I don't take care of it. So, and I think that then has, wider implications for how do we understand our place in the environment and ecology and all those kinds of things. But,
I hear you. That definitely resonates for me. For many of my students, it's not, though. They're either in the dorms or they're living in these rentals that they're rolling over every year, and they aren't around during the summer to do that gardening. I definitely resonate that with my peers. I've certainly seen.
Mm-hmm. I wonder, I mean, I don't know if it's this way in every part of the country, but succulents are a real big thing right now where we are. Students are really into like taking care of a cactus or a jade plant or an aloe plant. And I think part of it is because it's small and you can take it in your dorm. And part of it is that it doesn't need a lot of care because you don't have to water it as often. But I also think that there's something that people are feeling a connection to. This is something natural that I can have in my life, even if I am in an apartment or a dorm. Or maybe it also has to do with the fact that IKEA sells succulents and you can buy them pretty cheaply. I don't know, but but I think even something as simple as that could be, that might be a way. Last year in our chapel services, we talked about growth as for the whole series. And what we did was we gave everybody a packet of seeds at the beginning of the year and a little pot and some soil, and said, here, go grow a flower, go grow a plant, and some of them really stuck with it, and they'd come back later and like they'd have pictures on their social media of their plants growing, and they one time for Easter we had them all bring them and show them on camera, that kind of thing, so I think there are lots of ways we can get students connected. But I'd be interested in hearing if anybody else has any other ideas as well. Well, one of the joys of this gathering, this conference, this community is that we will continue to be in communication with each other. I think Benji has mentioned in other sessions, but I'll mention it here. We're going to be putting all the resources from these sessions, including the videos of the sessions, up on our website when this is all finished. And so if you have resources or things that you'd like to offer around any of the topics we've talked about, feel free to send those to me, and I will make sure that they get up on our board. Lauren also has a question there. Sarah, I don't know if you can see it or not, but it's talking about how students cope with uncertainty and stress, and the self-deprecating comments. I'm dying, I'm falling apart, those kinds of things. Do you have any thoughts on how, as she says, to lovingly redirect them towards self-compassion and positive self-talk?
Yeah, every time I try to do that, they roll their eyes at me. There's like, no, just let us be like this.
Yeah, part of it is just like allowing them to be sarcastic, right? And just kind of rolling with the punches. But I mean, I think you named something that's really important, like the self-compassion and self-talk. I mean, when that self-deprecating talk is really coming from a place of like, shame or sort of this sense of like, I'm really not worthy, or that can be a really big issue. So, I mean, I'll even say things like directly, like, I know you said that as a joke, but I don't believe that about you. And I'll just sort of like say like the truth, like, I actually see you as a really brilliant person. It can sort of be this like disarming, like, oh, like you cut, like you cut through my ego defense. Hold on, and they might just like brush it off and like, ha ha ha, whatever, but like, I kind of just like sort of set up this model of like, oh, I don't think about you like that. And we don't talk that way, like not in a shaming way, but like, here's the reality. It's like, you're amazing. So I don't know if that's helpful at all, but it's very common. Yeah.
Mhm.
No, that is really helpful, because I think another and then I've had to learn just to ask, like, sometimes I just check in and say, well, but are you really okay? Because if you're not, I'm here
Yeah.
as well. That sometimes early on I would misread, like, oh, that wasn't actually sarcastic. They really do need support right now. So it took a
Yeah.
little while to kind of like get the tone they're going for. And
Mhm.
Yeah.
yeah.
Because sometimes it can just be like a cry for help, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think something that helps too, Lauren, is modeling for them as well. So I have taken recently, at the advice of my own advisors, when somebody asks me how I'm doing and I'm not doing well, to say, I'm having kind of a crummy day, and to just be real about it. And especially, I think, around my students, to let them see that it's okay to say that you're not doing well. And then when you're just sort of kidding, then you can tell the tonal difference and those kind of things. And part of that's just getting to know your students, I think, really well. But for me, it really is, it's been liberating for me to say to people, because it was really hard at first. People would say, how are you? And I'm Midwestern, so I'm so used to saying, oh, I'm fine, but then to say, wait, that's not really what I meant. What I really mean is, I'm struggling today. I'm having a bit of a hard time. And I don't do that with everybody, obviously, but with people that I trust, and with my students, I'm willing to do that. Yeah.
Can I add in something here?
Sure.
I'm Chad Johns, Ohio Wesleyan University.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's important to distinguish between self-deprecation, which I think we mostly always need to call out, and gallows humor, which is an actual effective defense mechanism. I think one of the challenges of our society right now is that we're literally faced with 2 going on 3 global/national problems that as individuals, we don't have the problem, or we don't have the capacity to fix. And I think it's hard sometimes, like if I actually let myself think about that for more than 2 minutes, I lose my capacity to do anything. And so there's a level at which that humor wall is there to keep me from thinking about the apocalypse. Mm-hmm. So, like, it doesn't mean we're not in an apocalypse, and it doesn't mean I can't be honest with people I trust about how I'm actually doing. But I think that's 2 different things we're talking about, and knowing which one is being used is really important.
Yeah. Thanks. I appreciate that, Chad. Any other thoughts or any last questions before we wrap things up? Well, let me. Oh.
Reflecting on the challenge, Ellen,
Okay.
of this, the racial conflicts that are happening among the students, but also faculty.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a recent experience of doing the virtual invocation and benediction at the Franklin University graduation. And I knew that I could not do it without calling Rob Darkow, who is a Methodist, and having him help me write my prayer. Because walking in each other's moccasins right now through this challenge of racial inequity calls us as campus ministers to understand where our students are coming from. And, it just went great. And Rob said, thank you, Dr. O, that you asked me. I said, I couldn't have done it without you, Rob. And I think in companionship with our students, we can work better the message of the gospel right now, the good news of listening.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Ellen. I think, walking beside people, and as you say, walking in the moccasins or the shoes of others, I think is so important. And, sharing space, holding space with people during this, even if it's digital, there's still power, I think, in just looking someone in the eye, even if it's through a computer screen, just to say, I'm present, I'm here with you, and I'm walking with you through this. So, yeah. Couple things I want to mention as we finish. One of those is we have a couple more workshops and webinars coming up. July 23rd, we have a workshop on social media and also technology. And we also have on the 23rd our webinar on decentralizing self and cultural competence. That'll be delving into some of the issues around race and reconciliation in our society. July 27th, we have our workshops on fundraising and board development, and also ministry in a strange and new season. And then July 30th will be our final coffee hour and cocktail hour. So you'll be getting links for those as you did for this session, either the day before or the morning of. And we want to thank everybody for being here. Thank you, Sarah, for co-leading this with me.
Thank you all. Yeah, this has been great.
And buy The Awakened Life. Buy The Awakened Life and use that resource. And a shameless plug, buy Benedict on Campus. And if you're interested and you'd like to buy either of those, they're online. If you'd like a signed copy of my book, just contact me and I can get you one as well. But thank you all very much for this. If you have questions or anything like that come up, you feel free to reach out to us.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Sarah. We appreciate it.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Megan.
Megan.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody. Take care.
Blessings.
Have a good evening.